They said he died after a hunger strike. But the truth about Steve Biko's death is far more disturbing than anyone expected.
We see a completely non-racial society. We don't believe, for instance, in the so-called guarantees for minority rights, because guaranteeing minority rights implies the recognition of portions of the community on a race basis. We believe that in our country there shall be no minority, there shall be no majority, there shall just be people. And those people will have the same status before the law, and they will have the same political rights before the law. So in a sense, it will be a completely non-racial egalitarian society.
The winter wind moved quietly through the streets of South Africa in 1977. But beneath that calm surface, a nation was boiling. For decades, the system of apartheid had divided the country along rigid racial lines, controlling where people could live, work, study, and even whom they could love. Laws governed every movement of Black South Africans, turning ordinary life into a constant negotiation with authority. Yet in the midst of this oppressive structure, voices of resistance continued to rise. Among the most powerful of those voices was Steve Biko. Biko was not simply a political activist. He was something more unsettling to the apartheid regime. He was a thinker, a philosopher, and a man whose words could awaken a sense of dignity in people who had been told for generations that they were inferior. His message was simple but radical. Before people could free their land, they first had to free their minds. He believed that the greatest weapon of oppression was psychological control. If people believed they were powerless, they would never challenge the system that dominated them. And so, Biko spoke about pride, self-worth, and mental liberation. Through the Black consciousness movement, he encouraged Black South Africans to see themselves not as victims, but as powerful agents of their own destiny. To the apartheid government, this idea was terrifying. Political protests could be crushed, demonstrations could be banned, leaders could be imprisoned. But an idea, especially one that lived inside the minds of millions, was far harder to destroy. By the mid-1970s, Steve Biko had become one of the most influential voices of resistance in South Africa. His speeches circulated secretly among students and activists. His writings challenged the intellectual foundations of apartheid. Young people began to see themselves differently because of him. The government responded the way authoritarian regimes often do. They tried to silence him. In 1973, the apartheid authorities placed Biko under a banning order. These restrictions were severe. He was forbidden from speaking publicly. He could not leave his hometown of King Williamstown without permission. He was not allowed to meet with more than one person at a time. Even being quoted in the media was prohibited. The intention was clear. They hoped that isolation would weaken him. But Biko did not disappear. Even under these conditions, his influence continued to grow. Students, activists, and intellectuals traveled quietly to meet him. His ideas spread through underground networks. The more the government tried to suppress him, the more his reputation expanded. In 1976, South Africa witnessed one of the most significant uprisings in its history. Thousands of Black students in Soweto took to the streets to protest the government's decision to force schools to teach in Afrikaans, the language of the apartheid authorities. The protests turned violent when police opened fire on students. The Soweto uprising shocked the world. Images of young people confronting armed police spread across international media. Hundreds died, and thousands were arrested. The government became increasingly nervous about figures like Steve Biko. They believed intellectual leaders were encouraging unrest among the youth. Security police intensified their surveillance of him. Then, in August 1977, events began to unfold that would change history forever. On the 18th of August, Steve Biko was traveling with a colleague near Grahamstown when police stopped them at a roadblock. Such stops were common under apartheid, where security forces monitored movements constantly. The officers recognized him immediately. Despite the restrictions placed on him, Biko had been traveling without official permission. That alone was enough for the police to detain him. But this was not an ordinary arrest. He was taken into custody by the security police in Port Elizabeth, a branch of the force known for its harsh interrogations of political activists. Inside the police building, the atmosphere was tense and secretive. Security officers viewed activists like Biko not merely as political opponents, but as threats to national stability. Their goal during interrogations was to extract information about networks, supporters, and future plans. But Biko was not a man who frightened easily. During questioning, he remained calm and defiant. According to later testimonies, he refused to cooperate with the investigators. What happened next would remain disputed for years, but the outcome was tragically clear. At some point during his detention, Steve Biko suffered severe injuries to his head. Witness accounts and later medical findings suggested he had been violently assaulted during interrogation. The blows caused massive brain damage. Instead of immediately providing medical treatment, authorities kept him in custody. Days passed while his condition deteriorated. Doctors were eventually called to examine him, but their response has since become one of the most controversial elements of the entire case. Rather than demanding urgent hospitalization, medical staff allowed the police to continue detaining him. Biko became increasingly disoriented. His speech grew slurred. He struggled to stand or walk. At times, he appeared confused, unable to fully understand his surroundings. Despite these alarming symptoms, the security police did not rush him to a proper hospital. Instead, on September 11th, they decided to move him to Pretoria Central Prison, more than 1,000 kilometers away. The journey itself was shocking. Steve Biko was placed naked in the back of a police Land Rover and transported across the country for nearly 12 hours. By this time, his brain injuries were already life-threatening. When he finally arrived at the prison hospital in Pretoria, he was barely conscious. The next day, on September 12, 1977, Steve Biko died. He was only 30 years old. When the news reached the public, the apartheid government quickly issued an explanation. Officials claimed that Biko had died as a result of a hunger strike, but almost immediately, doubts began to emerge. Journalists, activists, and international observers questioned the government's version of events. Many who knew Biko personally found the explanation impossible to believe. One of the most determined individuals to challenge the official narrative was journalist Donald Woods. Woods had developed a friendship with Biko despite being a white editor in apartheid South Africa. Through conversations and interviews, he had come to admire Biko's intellect and courage. When the government announced that Biko had starved himself, Woods was skeptical. He began investigating the circumstances surrounding his death. Soon, disturbing details started to surface. Medical reports revealed that Biko had suffered extensive brain injuries. Bruises and trauma indicated he had been violently beaten. These findings directly contradicted the government's claim of a hunger strike. As Woods published articles exposing these inconsistencies, the story began attracting international attention. Newspapers around the world demanded answers. Human rights organizations began calling for an independent investigation. The apartheid government could not ignore the growing pressure. Eventually, authorities agreed to hold an official inquest into Steve Biko's death. The courtroom became a stage where the truth slowly began to emerge. Doctors testified about the condition they found Biko in during his detention. Police officers gave their own accounts of the interrogation process. Under questioning, contradictions began to appear in the testimonies of the security officers. Some claimed Biko had become violent during questioning, forcing them to restrain him. Others suggested he had injured himself. But medical evidence told a different story. Pathologists explained that the nature of Biko's injuries strongly suggested external trauma. The severity of the brain damage indicated repeated blows rather than accidental injury. The world watched closely as these details were revealed. Yet despite the growing evidence, the outcome of the inquest shocked many observers. The court concluded that while Biko had died from brain injuries, no individual police officer could be held directly responsible. In other words, no one was convicted. For many South Africans, the verdict felt like another injustice layered upon an already brutal system. But outside the courtroom, the impact of Biko's death continued to expand. International outrage intensified. Governments across the world condemned apartheid more strongly than ever before. Calls for economic sanctions against South Africa grew louder. Universities, churches, and political groups held protests in solidarity with the anti-apartheid movement. Even people who had previously known little about South Africa began learning about the realities of the system. Ironically, the attempt to silence Steve Biko had amplified his voice. His funeral in September 1977 became one of the largest political gatherings the country had ever seen. Thousands traveled from across South Africa to pay their respects. Activists, clergy, students, and ordinary citizens gathered to honor a man whose life had come to symbolize resistance. Among those present were prominent anti-apartheid leaders and international diplomats. The atmosphere was heavy with grief, but also with determination. Speakers reminded the crowd that Biko's ideas could not be buried with him. The philosophy he had championed, the belief that psychological liberation must come before political liberation, continued spreading among young South Africans. Years later, the story of his life and death would reach global audiences through books, documentaries, and films such as Cry Freedom, which told the story of his friendship with Donald Woods and the investigation that followed his death. As time passed, the political landscape in South Africa slowly began to change. Pressure from both internal resistance and international sanctions weakened the apartheid regime. Eventually, negotiations began that would lead to the dismantling of the system. When apartheid finally ended in the early 1990s, the country entered a new era under leaders such as Nelson Mandela. Yet even as the nation moved forward, the memory of Steve Biko remained deeply embedded in its history. In the mid-1990s, the newly established Truth and Reconciliation Commission revisited many crimes committed during the apartheid era. Among the cases examined was the death of Steve Biko. Former police officers involved in his interrogation eventually admitted that he had been beaten during detention. Their confessions confirmed what many had suspected for years. The truth that had once been hidden behind official statements and courtroom technicalities finally emerged. Today, Steve Biko is remembered not only as a martyr of the struggle against apartheid, but also as one of the most important thinkers in the history of African political thought. His writings continue to inspire movements that seek dignity, equality, and justice. Universities study his philosophy. Activists quote his words. Young people across the world learn about the man who challenged a powerful regime with the simple yet profound belief that oppressed people must first believe in their own worth. His death was meant to end his influence. Instead, it transformed him into a symbol that could not be silenced. The story of Steve Biko is therefore not only about tragedy, it is also about resilience, courage, and the enduring power of ideas. Even in the darkest moments of oppression, a single voice can awaken the conscience of a nation. And sometimes, when that voice is taken away, its echo becomes even louder than before.